Three. Hey everybody, it's our last session, session number 5 of our Ruth Bible study, Gleaning God in the Everyday. Throughout this study, we've repeated the phrase that Ruth is the redemption story of the whole Bible in 4 chapters and 3 characters. In session 1, if you go back, we asked the question, do you believe that God is working His best in your life, even when it might be at its worst? And then, can you glean God in your everyday? In session number 2, we asked the question, how essential is the role of community in the life of a disciple of Jesus? In session number 3, we asked the question, do you believe that your life and your choices are important in the eyes of the Redeemer, in the eyes of God? In session number 4, we asked the question, do you believe that God will get redemption done? Even when it doesn't look like it's happening, even when you don't understand it, do you believe that God will get redemption done? And so it brings us now to session number 5, again, our last session in this Ruth Bible study, Gleaning God in the Everyday. And we're doing a Gleaning God kind of a wrap-up here. This little short book condenses the entire Bible into these short little segments in these 4 chapters and about these 3 characters. And now as we've told the story, and we've told the story of the heartache of the beginning of the story with Ruth and Naomi, and then the love story with Ruth and Boaz, now we get to the grand finale, the happy ending of the story that we've been telling together. Ruth and Boaz, our 2 leading characters, have officially found love on the green pile. Romance and redemption are in the air, and all the cards are on the table, and marriage is their goal. In our last session, we looked at how Ruth risked it all for love and the hopes of not only of marriage, but redemption for both her and for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now this week, our scene opens, and we're going to get a closer look at Boaz, this Redeemer that we're talking about. At the end of chapter 3, Naomi tells Ruth, "Sit tight, my daughter." Naomi replied, "Until you know how it turns out. The man won't rest until he resolves the matter today." So Boaz is going to do just that. He's going to resolve the matter today. And so this is the story we find ourselves in as we start chapter 4, this final chapter of the story of Ruth. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. Just then, the Redeemer, the one that Boaz had told Ruth about on that grain pile, that someone who was a closer person to her was there, and he had to clear it up with him. Boaz sat down when he was passing by and said, "Hey, come sit next to me." So he turned aside and sat down. Then he took the man from the town's elders and said, "Sit down here." And so they all kind of gathered around. Boaz is kind of at the city gate of Bethlehem. Redemption could only come if Boaz was given the rights to redeem both Ruth and Naomi. So we've got Boaz at the town meeting place, and there's someone who is closer to Naomi and Ruth, who has more legal rights to redeem them than he does. They have a closer guardian redeemer. Now, just a reminder that a redeemer is, or also known as a guardian redeemer, is a close relative who has the responsibility to purchase back or restore something that has been lost by a family member. A guardian redeemer was someone who could take in and provide for, or restore the land to a widow who had lost everything, which would be the equivalent of losing financial independence or the ability to provide for yourself. In short, a guardian redeemer was someone who could buy back that protection or that provision for a family member. And Naomi had lost everything with the death of Elimelech, her husband. And all of this was done through the ceremony of marriage. It was a legal contract as much as it was anything else. And so that was what was going on today. And Boaz was about to figure it all out today. So our scene is set. Boaz makes his way down to the city gate and has a plan. And that brings us to this act in this whole story. In chapter 4, the act is really where the wedding takes place. Now we're going to look at this act in 3 scenes. We're going to look at scene 1, and we're going to talk about old so-and-so. We're going to look at scene 2, and we're going to talk about the witnesses who are there. And in scene 3, we're going to replay a story of redemption. So first up, let's look at our scene number one, old so-and-so, we'll call it. Now, at the beginning of our chapter, Boaz again finds himself at the town gate. That's what we read. And he's about to handle things for the matter today. It's like going to City Hall where there is a plan that's about to unfold. Boaz invites this guardian redeemer, the one closer to Ruth and Naomi, to come and sit down beside him. And if you're reading this, even just a little bit, you can tell he does so with a bit of an attitude. Anyway, Boaz starts this conversation with his man, and he calls him. If you read in the scripture, you can look at, he says, "Sir, come sit by me." In Hebrew, the word is poloni almoni. Poloni almoni, which means so-and-so. All that is to say, hey, guy, come sit next to me. It seems like just a normal little invitation, but there's also a little bit of disrespect that goes on in here. It's actually translated, hey, you old so-and-so, come on down here and sit next to me. Now, Boaz invites 10 of the other elders to sit down with him and old so-and-so to listen to Boaz's proposition. Basically, they're there to be witnesses, as he tells the guardian redeemer, old so-and-so, that there's an opportunity for him to redeem land from his long-lost relative, Elimelech, if he wants to. Now, this opportunity, or better maybe yet, a responsibility, would have been familiar to both old so-and-so and the people sitting there at the town gate. Remember how we look back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and other places where we talked about how the rules, the laws were set up to where you would actually be able to do that, where you're required to do that if you had the opportunity to do that. But it was a responsibility as much as it was an opportunity. So the story goes on in chapter 4. Boaz said to the Redeemer, "Naomi has returned from the field of Moab, and she is selling a portion of the field that belonged to her brother Elimelech, to our brother Elimelech. I thought that I should let you know and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you won't redeem it, tell me so that I may know. There isn't anyone to redeem it except you, and I'm next in line," he replied. "Well, I'll redeem it." So Boaz knew this. He makes this appeal. He gives him the opportunity, and it's kind of a chance for him to know that about what there is. But he also wants to lay out the responsibility of the arrangement. And so Boaz, in verse 5, drops this line. "Then Boaz said, on the day when you buy the field from Naomi, you also buy Ruth, the Moabite, the wife of a dead man, in order to preserve the dead man's name for his inheritance." So old so-and-so listens and to this point, and he's considered it. He knows the rules from Deuteronomy and all those kind of places, and he would have known what it meant to be a guardian redeemer and how he would have had to fulfill his responsibility to preserve a family name. He not only had to purchase the land, but again marry the nearest relative. And this was Boaz's 1-2 punch. He knew this would seal the deal. Immediately, the guardian redeemer counts the cost, and as suspected by Boaz, it's just too great for him. He's not interested. But the redeemer replied, "Then I can't redeem it for myself without risking damage to my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself," he says. "You can have my right of redemption because I'm unable to act as a redeemer." Basically, he said, I would, but anyway, in this moment, though it seems simple to us, there's a lot to pay attention to in the culture of the day. It's here that we have this redeemer, and he has this potential to redeem. And it's not just to redeem Naomi's story, which was tragic, but he has the opportunity to redeem Ruth's story as well. But the rub is that he's going to have to marry her. It's going to cost him a lot. Now, if you're a reader of the scripture, the story wouldn't sound too unfamiliar to you, at least the basics of it, because just on the other side of your Bible lives another story that is equally frustrating and disappointing. In Mark chapter 10, we see that there's an opportunity given to a rich young man by Jesus himself to follow him. And he goes away sad because he's told by Jesus that he has to sell all he has and give it to the poor. And the guy says, I have to go away sad because I own too much. So he's given that opportunity to participate in kingdom things, but the ask of letting go, the cost, is too much. and he just kind of has to walk away from it. And you know this, but what we value shapes our lives and what we're willing to do for them. And it affects how we get to participate in kingdom kind of opportunities. So, driven by his deepest and highest value, we see this guardian redeemer, unlike Boaz, actually hoards his riches. He's worried about his inheritance and how this chance at redemption will affect his inheritance. So he keeps food and future from the table as Boaz is ready to feed everyone that comes and gleans in his fields. There's a big difference between these two men. And if we think about the larger story that this small story is a part of, we see that so-and-so not only missed out on his own redemption, but also in participating in the redemption and renewal of all things. The name of so-and-so simply seems like a nod to the author that this guy is kind of forgotten to the story. But this writer is calling out something more than that, because if he had chosen to be a part of this story and redeem Ruth and marry her and have children with her, then he would have been a part of the larger redemption story that the whole Bible tells, that this story reminds us of. Now, we remember that the husband of Ruth and the sons of Naomi, that their names were Mahlon, which literally means sicko, and Chilion, which literally means done for, because these names help us understand that these two characters in the story are both forgettable and unmentionable, and their only value to the story is that they are done for and they are sick. In this moment, the author is drawing us again to the attention of the importance of names in the Hebrew story. That this name, this guardian redeemer's name, as so-and-so, is a name that's just kind of not even worth mentioning. But Boaz's name, his name is a sign of strength. His name is at the center of the history of God's redemptive story. His name is written into the Messiah, into Jesus' genealogy. But just like Orpah, this old so-and-so kind of opted out and he walked away from his chance to be a part of God's larger story. And he wasn't a bad guy for doing that, but he was someone who valued personal cost over kingdom goodness. He is someone who has let his desire for lesser things and monetary costs keep him from experiencing the most remarkable and valuable thing that ever was. In Act 1, old so-and-so misses out on this opportunity to be a part of God's goodness. But that doesn't stop the story. Which brings us to scene number 2. And this is the story about these witnesses that are gathered around that. In Israel, in former times, there was this practice regarding redemption and exchange. To confirm such a matter, a man would take off his sandal and give it to the other person. This was a way to process an unfolding transaction and make it binding in Israel. Then the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." And he took off his sandal. Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, the witnesses that were gathered around there, "Today you are witnesses that I bought the hand of Naomi, and that belonged to Elimelech, and that all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon, and also Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon. I bought it to be my wife, to preserve the dead man's name for his inheritance, and the name of the dead man might not be cut off from his brothers or from the gate of his hometown. Today you are my witnesses." Oh, did you catch that in the story? We said all along that it didn't really mention which son Ruth was married to, but now we find it here at the end of the story. She was married to Naomi's son Mahlon. We finally have an answer to a fact of the story that wasn't even worth mentioning at the very beginning, right? So this man is trying to say these words. Right away, we see he announces that the deal is done. He takes the shoe. I just don't have time for you to understand kind of exactly how cool this kind of story is to the thing. But just think about the shoe as a pen to sign the document. It's not like I'm putting my stamp. I'm putting my foot down on this thing, and it is a done deal. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord grant that the woman who is coming into your household be like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. May you be fertile in Ephrathah, and may you preserve the name in Bethlehem." So they are witnesses to this transaction, and they ask for a blessing to be upon Boaz and Ruth in their marriage, that they may have offspring and be a blessing to Bethlehem and to Israel. These 3 times in these verses, we find the words witness or witnesses, which is a clue to our reader to ask the question, what are they really witnessing? Now, at face value, it's easy to say, well, obviously, the marriage agreement, this purchase of the land, the redemption of Elimelech's name, and yes, those things are true, but what else? What are we meant to see here? Well, a few things, but again, I'm going to focus just on one of them. We have to go back to verse 10 if we want to get the full picture of what the story is really trying to tell us. It's here that Boaz states that he has required Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as his wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. To us, this is very basic, honestly, a kind of a boring statement. It wouldn't grab most of our attention because we don't really understand what's happening here. But let me explain what Boaz is really doing. At this moment, he is slowing things down and saying that beyond marrying this woman and redeeming the land, I am also redeeming her ex-husband, her dead husband's memory, making his name that was once associated with sickness or a sicko. Do you remember? Remember we said that? That now associated with an inheritance or a blessing. He's not only changing the past of their kind of ending, but he is changing the very sense of who this man ever was, that he is allowed to have an offspring that is there. But at this moment, he vows to do this, to promising that his son would inherit Elimelech's place, and he would ultimately preserve Elimelech's lamb. This moment is really about resurrection, lifting up the name of the dead and raising a family beyond the death of someone they love. God is not just renewing things for this small family in this small town at this particular moment in history, but it points to the reality that God is really renewing everything around them. God intends to redeem and rescue his people through the resurrection, dead things coming back to life, names being restored, things you thought were gone forever now restored. The impossible is now possible. That's what we're seeing here in this very bizarre, odd little moment, and not just a little story, but a larger story unfolding in the middle of this old, small town, Bethlehem. Boaz is painting a full picture of what God is like and what God is doing in the world all around him. And this image sets us up for our final moments in the story. And now in verse 11, our author begins to kind of tie everything together at the end of the story. And may your household be like the household of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, though the children that the Lord will give you is from this young woman. There are these 2 women by the end of the stories who were marked by strength and being beloved. 2 women who started their journey empty, but were filled again by God's goodness and God's redemptive story. So this blessing makes sense for Ruth. And it literally reads very well into this part of our story. Rachel and Leah were the only ones named. The author references Tamar. Again, we referred to her story and how important she was. Implicit in this story is now how God is using guardian redeemers, this guy Boaz, who is doing this great thing, to redeem kind of these important women in the history of God's people and how they become such a vital part of the story. The blessing would go something like this. May you and your woman be like Tamar, who was woven into God's redemptive story, a foreigner who is brought into the family of God. May you know that God has been seen your suffering and brought it to this redemptive moment through the goodness of all of your days. May you be like Tamar, marked by redemption and woven into God's plan for the world. So these guys seated around the center of the city gate are witnesses to resurrection. That's what they were. And these blessings not only confirm that, but they confirm that they understood that. They were witnesses to how redemption outlasts suffering. They were witnesses to how life outlasts even death. Which brings us to our next scene number 3, a replay of the whole redemption story. So Boaz took Ruth and became his wife. She became his wife. He was intimate with her, and the Lord let her become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. This woman said to Naomi, "May the Lord be blessed, who today hath left you without a redeemer. May his name be proclaimed in Israel. He will restore your life and sustain you in your old age. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you, has given birth to him. She's better for you than 7 sons." Naomi took the child and held him to her breast, and she became his guardian. The neighborhood woman gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They called his name Obed. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And then he made love to her. Wow, wow, wow. The Lord is doing an amazing thing right here in this kind of moment with these people. This story ends almost like it began, but it's turning everything around. You're introduced to a replay, a retelling of kind of chapter 1, how Naomi lost all her sons, and now these women say to her, she's more of a blessing to you than 7 sons would have been a blessing. 7 sons. If you married 7 sons, whose wife is she in resurrection? This story kind of comes back around again throughout this kind of tale here. Through the lens of what God has done in the everyday life, of Ruth's faithfulness and Naomi's journey. Remember that at the start of our story, Naomi had lost not just her husband, but also 2 sons. And it wasn't crushing enough because she also lost her very future. And there she is in chapter 1 in the midst of grief and despair. And so now it is powerful. At the end of this time, she is holding to her breast a child, a sign of new life in the midst of her pain and suffering. That her life is now being redeemed. Naomi's pain at the beginning of the story seems intense and overwhelming, that she can't even really see an end in sight. And now she is ready to see all of these things and see what God is doing. Maybe the question is, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever felt like your life is so marked by pain and grief that you feel like nothing is going to change? Nothing's ever going to change. It doesn't matter what's going on. I'm not sure this is ever going to be a good thing again. Naomi's life had just been shattered by this. And now, from this suffering, brokenness, and death, life is brought into the story again. The Bible story isn't a fairy tale, at least in the beginning of all this stuff. It's more of a tragedy. Naomi's life wouldn't change. But now, in the end of this story, we're brought into the opportunity where life comes even in the midst of chaos and death. In chapter 4, we see that the daughter of Ruth, her daughter-in-law, was a daughter to Naomi as well. This doesn't replace the loss of her sons, but there's something being signified here that we're meant to pay attention to. Finally, we see that there was a loss of future in chapter 1, and in chapter 4, a secured future and a name that would live on in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. All of this, at all of this moment in chapter 4, is meant to show us that God, the one in whom Naomi was certain in chapter 1 had left her in grief and pain and even afflicted her, was in fact working the whole time to bend her suffering towards the goodness of God all along. Everything terrible that had happened at the beginning of our story is now being redeemed. And this for us is not meant to give us a good feeling or a whisper of hope in our lives, but it is meant to remind us that even to declare to us at our most basic level that God is who God says He is and is doing the things that God promises to do in our lives. That's why Romans tells us this. We know that God works all things together for good, for the ones who love God, for those who are called according to His purpose. The language the author uses in this final dialogue in Ruth invites us to consider who is and who was redeeming Naomi's story all along. Is it Boaz, who will sustain Naomi in her old age? Or is it Boaz's son, Obed, who is now born into the end of the story? Is it Boaz or their son who is the guardian redeemer? Is it Boaz who is going to be famous throughout Israel? Or is the real hero of this story, the real redeemer of this story, God? Yes is the answer. All of those are true. That's why this story is so interesting for me of Ruth, because there are often people who struggle with Ruth because throughout these 4 chapters, there's no, one of the characters that's not real active in the story, on the pages and the words of the story, is God. God is really not seen as doing a lot in this story. But when you really read the story, you really see that God was doing something all along. It's really significant, and really in this moment, to its understanding the fullness of what God has been doing behind the scenes in the everyday moments of everyday people's everyday lives. Gleaning God in the everyday. And it's really essential to understanding the grand sweep of the story of redemption in these final moments of the marriage of Ruth and Boaz and their happy ending, and Naomi's worst moments are finding their way into some happy, great moments at the end. And maybe you've already noticed, but they are the same group of women from chapter 1 who have this interaction with Naomi where she asks them not to call her blessed anymore, but to call her bitter. And now they are the ones who are telling Naomi how she is blessed. They are reminding her of who God says she is, not who anyone else says she is, but who God has said she is in this very moment. So they seemingly have to understand that very clearly. Sometimes other people see things in us that we don't even see in ourselves. My experience of my call story is when I was really to kind of accept and admit that maybe God was calling me to this, and I started having conversations with people. They would say, well, I'm not surprised. I kind of thought this was where this would go and where you would end up. I had the same interaction when my son Jonah came to me to discuss his call to ministry. We sat in a car outside a shoe store one afternoon when he was home from college for the weekend, and he told me that he thought he was called to ministry and maybe was going to start studying in that direction. And I just simply said to him, well, I wondered when we might have this conversation because I thought this might be where you were going. Sometimes other people recognize the call of God in our lives long before we ever do. And they bless her in this moment. They recognize the call that God is making in Naomi's life, not just by throwing her a grand party when it's all said and done, but instead they bless her by naming her what she couldn't see in herself. In our story, it's wild to me that Naomi, after everything has been unfolding right around her in this moment, we find no dialogue from her, no eruption of praise or gratitude that might end the story and tell us what she was experiencing. And we just don't see that in her. It's almost as though she still couldn't fully see what God had done in her life, even in this moment, how God was there. It took her a while probably to get there, but the beauty of this story is that God has been active all along, not in the ways that Naomi first thought, that he had cursed her, that he had abandoned her, that he had left her bitter, but that God was in the story behind the scenes redeeming things all the day, that God redeems us in the everyday part of our lives. It was her community that traced God's redemptive story in her life, and it was her community that reminded her that God had named her blessed, and she was exactly who she was. Her community spoke what was true about her. Her community spoke out hope in the midst of her. She didn't feel like she had any. Her community named her redemption before she ever felt redeemed. So this story is a great story. It reminds us of all this. And we find ourselves at some point in this story being turned into the understanding the chaos that we're experiencing, the realities of life just outside of Eden, life that is God active in the story all along until Jesus comes back and makes it all new. And so that's the beauty of the story that's going on here. So my question for you as we wrap up this last session of Gleaning God in the Everyday, our study of Ruth, is which part of this story do you find yourself in? Which end of the story do you find yourself in right now? Do you find yourself not seeing God in that everyday stuff? Or are you coming around the end of the story where God has been working behind the scenes all along? What might be keeping you from finding yourself at the other end of the story? If you are at the beginning of the story, what is your struggle in that area? And what would keep you from gleaning God in the everyday, from seeing God at work behind the scenes of your everyday life? What would keep you from living and seeing and celebrating God's redemption story as a way of life? How He's worked through in the last week of your life, or in the last years of your life, or in the good times of your life, or in the struggles of your life to redeem you. And who do you have in your life right now, like Naomi had these women of her community, who can help name what God is doing in your life, how God is redeeming your story, even when you may not be able to see it. So we need help. We need help like Naomi needed help, seeing what we sometimes cannot see for ourselves. We need help believing and trusting and seeing God in the midst of the chaos, especially when it feels like we just can't see it ourselves. Have you ever been unable to see where God is working in your story through His goodness? Have you ever been in a place where you failed to see where God was at work, or how He was redeeming something that you felt was unredeemable? The beauty of a story like Ruth's is that we are reminded that God has not left us alone. He has not cursed us or abandoned us or left us without help. The community of people of God that He's put around us is God's witness to us that we are not alone and that God is at work in the story all along. And here I am today with that same question we started to ask at the beginning of this story. We've asked all along, what would it mean if God was redeeming everything that you've lost this past year, this past decade? What would happen if God was redeeming all of that, moment by moment, face by face, sickness by sickness, tragedy by tragedy? What if God was redeeming everything right now? What would that mean? And how would that change my view of God, even when I have felt so wounded by God? And how would that change what I believe about myself? These are the stories that we ask ourselves as we wrap up our story of Ruth gleaning God in the everyday. May we find and see God in the everyday of our life, in the ups and the downs of everyday moments of our life. And when I can't see it, may I know that there's someone around who can speak that promise, that hope, who can see that in my life, even when it's hard for me to see myself. May you glean God in your everyday.